When we talk about addiction courses, we normally refer to a specific course for drug and alcohol addiction or pornography. But in this course, we're looking at general addiction. So anger can be addiction, workaholic can be addiction, eating can be an addiction. You'll find it has the three elements which are present. First one is a craving for the object of the addiction. Secondly, a loss of control over its use or behaviour. Thirdly, continued involvement with it despite its adverse consequences. So that's what we're going to address, those three elements in this addiction course. Our addiction model is based on the original 12-step model of Alcoholics Anonymous. It was developed in the 1930s and 40s, 80 to 90 years ago. The reason it was chosen, it had two connecting principles: behaviour and spirituality. In the last 80 or 90 years, psychology has gone a long way. It's moved from an original behaviour model in the 1940s and 50s to include cognition, emotions, and another whole range of other factors, right up to mindfulness in the 21st century. And because of this development in psychology, we can now reframe the 12-step model based on the subconscious mind. And that's what we've done in this course. We'll now go and have a look at that in detail. We're looking here at the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. It's not the original version back in the 1930s or 40s, but it's a current version that's being used in the 21st century. We'll just look at the first three steps as a basis for setting up what we're going to look at in our particular model. So the first point is we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. Secondly, we came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And three, we made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. These words, as we understood him, have been used to move away from the word God to higher self or just spirituality. But the first three steps, in summary, say that we have a habit which we're unable to control. It's unmanageable. That we realize that we can't control it and that we have to rely on something else other than our willpower to do that. So we'll now go on and look at what that means in the 21st century. In this slide, we're looking at a CBT fourth wave model, 2025 version. It's called cognitive principle therapy. Most therapies in Western society, even today, are called cognitive behaviour therapies. But we're now up to the fourth wave. If you go back to the original cognitive behaviour therapy, or even before that, which was the basis of the 12 steps of AA, there was just behaviour, and then there was God or spirituality. And so you could see there's a big gap between behaviour and God. But in this 2025 version, we can see a number of steps that can link those two elements. In the third wave of CBT, we had behaviour, we had emotions, we had cognition, senses, energy, and values, but they were all add-ons, in additions. And the last add-on was spirituality, now called mindfulness, which has been added in to CBT, cognitive behaviour therapy. But what the fourth wave's done is change the order in which they're worked. That is, spirituality drives values, which drives energy and assimilates with the senses in the body, attaches to cognition, forms emotions, and from that process, behaviour becomes the symptoms. So what we're going to look at in this program is how each of those elements can be controlled in a way to control addictive behaviour. It's fair to say that the 12-step AA program or narcotics program or codependency or pornography addictions goes over a long period of time. We're talking months, and people stay in the AA programs for years. Some people have been there 20, 30 years attending regular AA sessions to control their addictions. So we obviously can't make that sort of change in a short program like this. This program is to give awareness, provide awareness for change, and to start some of the processes that will result in change. The best way to use this course is it's broken down the 12 steps into 4 groups of 3 steps each. So you work through the first 3 steps, think about those, pick up pointers to change, then you move on to the next 3 steps. If you get stuck in the next 3 steps, you might have to come back to the first 3 steps again. And you gradually work through the whole 12 steps in this circular way, going back, moving forward, coming back, moving forward. In that way, you'll consolidate your learning, and also you'll get a deeper understanding of how to apply the principles which are taught in this course. We'll now start to show you how addictions work from a point of view of a 2025 model. And then before we move on from this particular section, we'll look at relapse prevention. Relapse is a normal part of addiction, and we have to talk about that so you understand how to handle it. And we'll do that at the end of this next few slides. This chart's called the cognitive principle matrix. It's a 7-level matrix with 7 principles at each level. The matrix is quite complex in its design and how it works. So I'm not wanting you to understand that. I just want to follow through some basic ideas that will come up, and so that you can get an understanding of how addictions occur. And then you'll understand in the following slides in a more simpler way. The matrix is structured at 7 levels. The top 4 levels are all positive, and they refer to the head, the heart, the gut, and the spirit. So at level 7, you have the 7 spiritual principles which guide the head at level 6. Level 6 is where you're using your logic and common sense and your 5 senses to understand the truth and other principles, using wisdom under the guidance of the spirit. When you're using levels 6 and 7 together, according to this theory, you'll be able to control the positive levels at level 4 and 5. So level 5 represents the heart, and level 4 represents the gut. So you've got the gut at level 4 going to the heart at level 5, going to the head at level 6, going to the spirit at level 7. And all these things are positive, and life is going very well for you because there's no negatives in your life. But this is not reality. There's always negatives in your life at some point, every day, or certainly frequently. So what happens when a negative comes along? You drop down to level 3. So while you're at level 4, 5, and 6, you, through, say, in column 1, you have hope. That is, you know the outcome because you know the truth, you trust the person, and you have courage. So the more courage you have, the more trust you have, the more truth you'll find, and the more hope you'll find. So you'll just keep getting stronger and stronger. But when a negative comes along at either level 5 or level 5, when someone lies to you, you could drop down to level 3 and have fear that things aren't going to go the way you thought. Likewise, you could have a task to do at level 4, but you haven't got enough courage to do it, so you develop fear at level 3. So level 3 is the negative side of level 4 or 5. Things happening in relationships at the heart level or things happening at the gut level at level 4. When you're at level 3, everything is negative but normal. It's normal because you're following the rule of not taking negative things personally, because right at this moment, they're not personal. They may feel personal, but they're not personal. Personal means you're under physical attack. So if you're not under physical attack right at this moment, they're just negative, but not personal. They're negative and behavioural. So an example would be, let's go back and look at column 6 and down to guilt, which is a negative principle at level 6. And you're a 5-year-old boy and you're riding along your bike with your mates, and all of a sudden you hit a pothole, you fall over your bike, off your bike, and cut your knees and you're bleeding. Now, what's supposed to happen? It's not personal. You just hit a pothole, you weren't looking where you're going, and you've fallen over. So you should feel guilty because you should be watching where you're going. So guilt is a normal negative reaction. You should then go to the next level up, self-control, get back on the bike, have some compassion for yourself at level 5, and continue riding on. But let's say that's not what happens. So what does happen is you drop down 2 levels to shame. And the reason for that is that there's blame. And the blame can occur for 3 reasons. 1, you blame yourself because you felt shame when you fell off the bike. Secondly, you can feel blame because your mates are now laughing at you and making fun of you. Or thirdly, you can have blame because the pothole was there and it shouldn't have been there. And so you go home after this fall from this bike and the shame that you experience, and your father sees that your legs are cut and he says, "What happened?" And you tell him you fell off your bike. Then he says, "Did anyone else fall off their bike?" And you say, "No." And then he launches into you. You're stupid, you're useless, you never do anything successful, you're always a failure, you're never going to be any good in your life. He says that to him every time he makes a mistake. So the shame becomes despair, hopelessness, rejection, rage, paranoid fear, depending on the personality of the child. And he starts to have trauma experiences and can fall into depression or have panic attacks. And so this is what happens when you develop negative things personally, because as a child is not able to split the person from the behavior. It takes all personal attacks, all attacks as personal, not behavioral. That's the nature of being a child. But an adult should be able to identify what is personal from what is behavioral. And for reasons we'll explain later, you should always take negative things behaviourally unless you're under physical attack, as previously stated. I'll explain that in more depth in other slides. But now we come to how addictions occur. Addictions occur because the fear, the shame, the panic, the despair at level 1 has to be covered up, and it gets covered up with, because it's called a false negative, gets covered up with a false positive. And this false positive can be a fantasy, it can be a delusion, it can result in narcissisms and false entitlement, false self-interest, false self-confidence, anything to get past the trauma of the fear at level 1. Later in life, it can become a physical addiction to drugs or alcohol, escapes into pornography, computer games, workaholic, binge eating, anything to cover up the trauma. This is how negative and personal become false negatives and develop into false positives, which is the addiction. We'll now go on and have a look at this, not from a principle point of view, using principles, but by looking at the three selves. In this slide, we're looking at the three selves: the experiencing self, the remembering self, and the real self. The term experiencing self and remembering self come from Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. Thinking slow was the experiencing self, processing words at 40 bits per second. Remembering self was thinking fast, processing words 1,000,000 times faster than that, using electrical energy. So they're operating in vastly different speeds, the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, the conscious and the subconscious. This concept was also developed by Ian McGilchrist in his book, The Matter with Things, where he says for 300,000 years, the experiencing self was used to find food, whereas the remembering self and the rest of the right brain, right hemisphere, was used to keep the person safe. So you have the left hemisphere driven by greed for food, and you have the right hemisphere driven by fear for safety. Once a person finds food, enough food, the ego, which is what Freud called the experiencing self, the ego is driven for more power and more money once it's found food, because it's driven by greed. The right brain, which is a subconscious internal processing, doesn't need more power and more, it just needs enough. It's not greedy, it's driven by fear to stay safe. So what happens is, this is how addictions occur using the three selves. When a false negative occurs at level 1, it creates the trauma. Then what happens, the false positive is created by the ego, because the ego is driven by greed, doesn't want the false negative, doesn't want the shame exposed out into the world. And because it's an ego, it will cover it up with a false positive, an addiction of any type, or lying, or anything to cover up the false negative. Now, the role of the real self, which is the conscience, where all the 7 spiritual principles operate through, the conscious is only positive and it only operates from the spirit, even though sometimes it's difficult to discern in your head whether the voice you're hearing in your head is coming from your shadow. Your shadow is the combination of your false negative and false positive, or is the voice in your head coming from your real self, your conscience? You know your conscience talks to you all the time, telling you to do this or don't do that. And sometimes your ego goes along with your conscience and you're true to yourself, or sometimes your ego doesn't want to go with your conscience because it wants to do its own thing, because it's driven by greed. What 99% of people don't know is the real self talks or acts on the shadow. It wants the shadow removed, because the shadow, the false negative, is actually a physical cell in memory that needs to be got out of the body, just like a cancer cell would be. It has to be attacked and got rid of. So the real self, the conscience, wants the negative trauma exposed out into the real world so that it gets fixed. Whereas the ego doesn't want the shame or the blame of itself, and it builds the false positive covering it up. So a person who has a shadow can never be at peace in their life because internally, subconsciously, even though they're not aware of it, is a battle going on between the ego and the real self. If a person was personally totally balanced person with no false negatives and false positives, they'd be operating at a normal level where they'd be experiencing life and having normal positive or negative memories at levels 3, 4, 5, and 6 at the top level there. Whereas a person under massive addictions is normally entirely stuck at the bottom level. When you're under severe addictions, you're operating nearly entirely at the bottom half of this slide. The false ego is in control, creating stronger and stronger false positives, covering up the false negative. The false positive bypasses the conscience and goes straight to the ego. The conscience, if it gets used less and less, like any muscle in your body, it becomes weaker. So as it becomes weaker, the ego becomes stronger, and so do the false positives. The increase in lying, the increase in addiction, all occurs because the ego is gathering more and more power through the false positive addiction. The ego uses all of the following defense mechanisms to cover up the false negative. It'll use them from the denial group to deny there's a problem or dissociate from it, where it doesn't actually believe that it occurred. From the displacement group, it'll place the blame onto something that's irrelevant and not on itself. It'll project the problem it has onto another person, a partner, or someone else. It'll avoid there's a problem, facing the problem of the false negative. It will procrastinate and have difficulties dealing with the false negative. It'll regress to a child and act like throwing a tantrum or behaving irresponsibly. It'll repress the feeling of the false negative as though it doesn't exist. It'll use its logic and intellectualization to talk down another person. It'll overcompensate in other ways through more addictions. This is the common defense mechanism that an ego will use to cover up the false negative. We've now got to the end of the first module, so we can restate the first 3 steps based on the 2025 model, as distinct from the original AA 12-step program. Step 1, we admit that our experiencing self, the ego, is powerless to control the shadow, that is, the addictions and the unresolved issues. This is because the ego is driven by greed and does not want to control the shadow. In fact, it wants to maintain the shadow. Step 2, we came to believe that our real self, our conscience, can restore our principles and remove our shadow. We now understand the conscience is driven by the top 7 principles in the spiritual realm. Step 3, we've made a decision based on hope, the hope of knowing, to turn our experiencing self and our remembering self over to the real self and start using these spiritual principles to gain control back in our lives. If you can accept these 3 statements, you can now move on to module 2. If there's some doubt or lack of understanding, try going back and revisiting the first slide in this module 1. Before we start module 2, we should look at the concept of relapse. Relapse occurs in all addictions. In the 2025 model, the relapse relates to when the ego once again allows the shadow to exist and override the conscience. The ego driven by greed drives the relapse. So when we look at the word relapse, we're looking at the spelling R-E-L-A-P-S-E. The L is the uppercase. It represents when we relapse, how high or deep we go in the vertical axis and how long we last in the horizontal axis of the L. The idea is that every time you relapse, the capital L gets smaller until eventually it's just a normal lowercase l, and relapse is just a word. It's not part of your life. So don't blame yourself for relapse. Don't take it personally. It's just part of the process of overcoming your addictions. In Module 2, we're looking at the purpose of life so that we can get our addictions back under control and focus on the correct thing, not the shadow, trying to cover up the false negatives with false positives under the influence of the left brain's ego. We'll now go on and look at how we do that. In 2021, Ian McGilchrist released the book, The Matter with Things. It was 800,000 words on the difference between the left and the right brain. It's a significant book which will change the way we think about psychology in the future. McGilchrist says for 2 million years we've been hunter-gatherers from the time we stood up on 2 legs as Homo erectus. Right up to 10,000 years ago, that's what we did, hunter-gather. The left brain was driven by greed to find food, and the right brain was driven by fear to stay safe. McGilchrist gave the example of the bird. When the bird's on the ground, the left brain, which controls the right eye, focuses 100% on just picking out seed. The right brain, which controls the left eye and the rest of the body, is just waiting for a predator to come. So when the predator comes, the bird just takes off. Picked up by the right brain system, the left brain is still looking at the seed. This makes the bird a highly efficient eater of food on the ground while maintaining maximum safety. Humans don't have that level of need for safety, but we operate exactly the same way. The left brain, the focus on getting things with food, etc. But once it's found food, once we stopped being hunter-gatherers, we started seeking other things. And the greed caused the ego to control ourselves. We became overly focused on power and money and covering up the deficiencies of our fears in the right brain. We'll now go on and look at what is the real purpose of life. Here we're looking at the meaning of life, the purpose of life in the right brain or right hemisphere, because the 2 hemispheres are separate in all creatures. And as we've said in the previous slide, they have different purposes. The purpose of the left brain in finding food was just to support the lower level purpose of the right brain, which was the gut brain, to create peace through being in control. Remember, the purpose of the right brain is to stay safe. So the left brain, in service in the gut principle, is to find food, clothing, shelter, material possessions which keep the right brain safe. And when you feel safe, you have peace. When you have peace, you can then move up to the heart. In order to stay safe throughout history, we used to live in tribes. And therefore, the purpose of the heart brain was to attach to others for the purpose of safety. Safety in numbers, safety from protection from wild animals. If you were evicted from the tribe, you would be subject to danger and probably die alone in the jungle. So you need attachment for safety. And that's the purpose of the left brain, is to help attach through love so that we end up with love in our heart. The purpose of head is support the bottom two purposes: to work towards getting control, to work towards attaching. That's the purpose of the right brain at the head level. And when it's doing that, we experience joy, because joy comes after love and after peace. We also need to have a higher spiritual, somehow built into us. We need to connect to a higher power, a higher thing, which could be ourself. In here, we just call it the I am. We have that through hope. Hope is knowing, not knowing about something, which is a left brain function to know about things using logic and common sense. We're talking about here hope, the hope of just knowing, or through experience of knowing. And so the role of the right brain is to have peace, love, joy, hope in the I am. And we do that through the left brain supporting the right brain with control, seeking attachment, seeking purpose. When the left brain can't handle that, then it goes for money or power, and we lose focus. And as we've said, addictions is where we've experienced things in the right brain which created fear. We want to deal with that in the real world with the left brain, but it doesn't want to deal with it because of the ego and the shame, so it covers it up with an addiction. And the whole purpose of life, according to the right brain theory, is lost. Here we're looking at what's called a Johari window. We're looking at it for the purpose of understanding our addictions. Doesn't matter what addiction it is, it can be fitted into one of these four blocks. It's called awareness through our consciousness, which is our left brain. We call it specific consciousness, in that we can see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, feel it. The first block at the top left-hand corner is where our addiction is open to others. They can see what we're doing. We can see what we're doing. It's open to everyone. On the bottom left-hand corner, our addictions are blind to ourselves, but open to everyone else. They're blind to ourselves because of denial or dissociation. We just can't face the addiction. On the bottom right-hand corner, the addictions are hidden from others. We are aware of what the addictions are, but others can't see them because we conceal them very well. These are all three a part of specific consciousness that the experiencing self knows. But what we're trying to get to is the unknown self, the I am, the is, which is in general consciousness. It's just our connection to our spirituality. And if we can move from the other three to our spiritual consciousness, we'll be able to have control over our addiction, because there's no addiction in general consciousness. It's only in specific consciousness, in our experiencing left brain, through our shadow, through our remembering self of the shadow, and through the direct knowledge of our experiencing left brain. So that's the purpose, to move not to who I am, not to what is this, but just I am, and it is, just is. In this slide, we're looking at the left brain specific consciousness versus the right brain general consciousness. The problem with addiction is there's an over-identification in the mind-body with the shadow, with the false negative, which has caused the despair, the shame, the paranoid fear, the rage, the rejection. There's an over-identification with it. And that's resulted in an attachment to a false positive, to the addiction. So rather than an attachment to love, which was the real purpose of attachment, There's an attachment to a thing, an escape from the hurt of lack of trust, respect, acceptance, and commitment, which comes through attachment, to an attachment to a behaviour, an alcoholism, a drug addiction, a workaholic, food, whatever it is, the addiction, it's an attachment to it. So we need to get away from that attachment. We have to get away from specific consciousness, because when there's a false identification and a false attachment, then there's a delusion that happens within time, space, and matter. And we'll have a look at that in the next slide. But completing this slide, we're trying to identify with our spirit. We move to the right, to general consciousness. And we attach to our conscience, which is just our values. And we identify with the spirit. And when we just identify with our conscience, that is no thinking, no logic, no common sense, no thinking at all, just silence, which is the basis of all meditation and mindfulness, no thinking. We attach to our spirit, and we attach to our conscience, and we access general consciousness, which will give us the truth on how to move forward. In the previous slide, we talk about this distortion in time, space, and matter when we follow the wrong path of the ego due to addictions. When we're talking the difference between general consciousness and specific consciousness, we're talking about general consciousness being the one pathway. There's only one way, whereas specific consciousness is called duality. There's always a choice, a two-way choice. So in time, there's a choice between now and then. In space, there's a choice between here and there. And in matter, there's a choice between this and that. The truth is, we're always in the now, here, this, focusing on this here now. We're never that, there, then. But the delusion of the ego and the addictions is to focus on that addiction rather than focus on this, which was what we should be focused on. And we'd rather be over there at the addiction than right here where we're supposed to be focused. And then we start to think about the past and the future rather than focusing on the now. We focus on the then. So the ego will lead us down the wrong pathway and not the true pathway, which is time, space, and matter, is this here now. If we shut off our five senses and there's no smell, sound, taste, touch, or seeing, and we exclude all our memories from the past relating to those five senses, if we imagine that, we're aware that we're here, but it feels like nothing because there's no senses and there's no memory. But we know there's something. We call this, on this slide at the top, no thing. It's not a thing, but it's not nothing. It's a no thing. And in that no thing, time just flows. Time is not about now and then. It just is. It's just time. And so this is a different concept of time and no thing when we enter general consciousness. So that is the single pathway, to go into our conscience through meditation or through not thinking and find the no thing and just flow in time. It just is. So when we're in addiction, we're trying to get out of the pathway of duality into the right hemisphere pathway of non-duality. Because as we said, we're being controlled by our ego. and it's leading us to distortions or taking us down the wrong path. We get confused between self and others. We get over-focused on the past or the future. We do too much negative comparative thinking and predicting. And we get lost in the sea of confusion, which leads to the addiction. We want to get away from that. We want to go for the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere focuses on not the split between self and others, just the I am. Not the past or the future, the now. Not the comparative predicting thinking, just the fact it is. And when we can think about the I am in the now and it just is, the outcome is pure consciousness, pure general consciousness. So in the next slide, we'll have the steps of how to do that, to complete this module. This is the mantra, which will get us out of the duality thinking, following the ego down the wrong pathway of that, there, then. It'll keep us focused on this, here, now. And we do that through saying a mantra. A mantra is not positive thinking. Positive thinking doesn't work against a strong addiction. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the addiction. But a mantra will get through into the subconscious and align itself, the conscious mind, with the right brain purpose, which the end result is hope, love, peace, and joy in the I am. So the mantra becomes saying the words repeatedly: I am hope, love, peace, and joy. I am hope, love, peace, and joy. Repeat that for 3 to 5 minutes at a time, particularly when the mind wanders into negative thinking of the past or the future or towards the addiction. Whenever the thinking's about the addiction, repeat the mantra: I am hope, love, peace, and joy. Because this purpose in the right brain is stronger than the left brain ego, then eventually the mantra will take hold and the addiction will gradually reduce. And so the relapse, which we talked about earlier, will get weaker and weaker. This is key to change, to focus the single pathway, following the mantra: I am hope, love, peace, and joy. We have now come to the end of Module 2, and we can restate steps 4, 5, and 6 in our new 2025 addiction therapy version. Step 4, we unconditionally accept that our shadow, that is the false positives and false negatives, is present in our lives. Step 5, we have admitted to our real self, our conscience, the full extent of our shadow. And step 6, we are entirely ready to have our real self remove our shadow. If you've been through this second module and commit to those steps we've just read, 4, 5, and 6, you can now move on to Module 3. If you need to go back to the start of Module 2, you can work through it again. At the end of Module 2, at Step 6, we said we were entirely ready to have our real self remove our shadow. We're going to look at that in this module, Module 3. The first step is to get rid of the false positive. After that, we'll look at the rules which we need to follow, and then we'll look at forgiveness, of how to start working on level 1, the false negative. But let's start with the false positive. You can see on line 2 of the matrix, the false positive is driven by the ego, and it has these 7 principles behind it: fantasy, conceit, greed, false self-confidence, delusion, self-entitlement, and false self-interest. And when you move to the top spiritual principle in green, also humility. Humility is the way to get rid of those 7 false positive principles. So you have to be able to humble yourself. You'll have to stop thinking of your ego. Start dumping your ego for the sake of your real self. And if you can move through that process, you're then ready to move on to the rules. In this module, we look at rules, but only in summary form. The rules are covered in more detail in the anger management course. Anger management is often a prerequisite to addiction course because with addictions, we don't treat anger using assertiveness. We often use it overtly, too strong of anger, trying to be controlling or overly controlling by the ego. Or alternatively, we try to avoid responsibility by using passive anger. But neither are appropriate. The appropriate one is to be assertive with anger. But in any case, we'll have a look at the key points of the rules which affect addiction in this module. These are the 7 rules of the cognitive principle matrix, a summary of them. They come in pairs. The first word is the dominant one. The second word is the lesser. So in the first rule, subconscious versus conscious, the subconscious mind, driven through principles, and the conscience controls the ego or the experiencing self, which triggers the addiction. The second rule, principles versus comparative thinking. Principles follow the single pathway or purpose of the right brain. The experiencing self uses comparative thinking to choose between this and that, here and now, there and then. But because it's an ego and it's addictive, it has addictive behaviours, it often chooses the that, there, then, which is the addiction, rather than this, here, now, which is the purpose or what the brain should be working on. Influence versus concern. Influence means I can do something about it. Concern means I can do nothing about it. So I should always focus on my influence, not on my concern. When I have concerns, I should use a higher level principle of unconditional acceptance and just accept it without conditions. I can't do anything about it. Rule 4, support versus challenge. The problems with addiction is there's too much challenge from the addiction and not enough support. So we have to use the whole 7 rules to give us support. We have to use the subconscious, we have to use principles, we have to focus on influence. In negative situation, we focus on behaviour and not take it personally. We make sure control and responsibility are balanced, and we stay inside ourselves and don't go outside ourselves. That way, support will be challenged, will meet the challenge of the addiction. Behaviour versus person. We'll talk about this in the next slide. Rule 5, behaviour versus the person, is the most relevant rule for this particular module we're in now. Because we learn that what happens with addictions, we take the negative thing personally. We go against the rule. When things are positive, they're personal. When they're negative, they're behavioural. We'll get to understand why a person takes negative things personally in the following few slides. But the rule we must follow if we want to be successful in overcoming our addictions is to take negative things behaviourally, not personally. Rule 6, control versus responsibility. They always have to be balanced. We find with our addictions that one of 3 things happen. we become too controlling and our left brain controls the agenda and we escape into addictions. Or we give up responsibility, and a way of covering up the lack of responsibility is through addictions. So the rule is that control and responsibility should be always balanced. If you take too much responsibility and not enough control, you'll get anxiety, and that often leads to depression, which can lead to addictions as an escape from the responsibility because of lack of control. So the rule is control and responsibility must be equal. The last rule is inside versus outside. You should always stay inside yourself and solve the problem and not go outside yourself. People who can't find the principle and use the principle with inside themselves will go outside themselves. So when I worked at a drug and alcohol centre, you talk to alcoholics, so why are you going outside yourself drinking alcohol? And it was normally due when they were very young, they lacked courage. They lacked courage because they couldn't mix with females and they need a few drinks to give them courage. Or they lack courage to stand up to bullies, and then after a few drinks they could have the courage to fight. Some people will go outside and use alcohol because they can't face life and want to escape through it, so they binge drink, and it takes away their memories of the negative sides of life. So people go outside themselves with alcohol to overcome the lack of courage they have inside themselves. People go outside themselves with violence and abuse because they lack respect within inside themselves and haven't got the words or the techniques to fix the problem, so they attack the person. People go outside themselves because they lack acceptance inside themselves with people pleasing, trying to please others to get acceptance. Some people go outside themselves and use marijuana to find peace because they can't find peace inside themselves. The rule is always stay inside yourself and don't go outside yourself to cover up a weakened principle. This is the last and final rule. In the previous two slides, we said the most important rule for Module 3 is positive, personal, negative behaviour, and not take negative things personally. When things are positive, they are personal, and when they're negative, they are behavioural. This is the rule. When things are negative and taken personally, then we have lost respect or trust and are trying to force respect. We've become fearful of losing control, and emotions and instincts have taken over, and we've moved to fight, flight, or freeze. The problem there is instincts, because we've been Homo sapiens for 300,000 years, and most of that time we were hunter-gatherers. And our brains have been programmed through instincts to believe that an emotional threat will result in a physical threat. And therefore, the roar of a tiger means there's a tiger there. But in this 21st century of 2025, in most Western societies, there's no physical threat following an emotional threat. It's an illusion. It's a delusion. It's not real. But that's not how our right brain instincts have taken it. So we take negative things personally. We develop shame and blame, and we can't handle that. We have to escape from it, from freeze. We escape into addictions, and it's all false. And unless you can go back and challenge that view of not taking negative things personally, then you'll be stuck in your addiction. The second problem with positive, personal, negative, and behaviour is that a child under 16 really struggles to separate the person from the behaviour because their instincts are so strong and their self-control can't match that. So that sometimes when they experience trauma or negative events and they get shame and blame, they develop addictions which then become habits, and in adulthood, they struggle to deal with them. But once you've got responsibility of being an adult, you're responsible for going back and changing the negative and making it behavioral and not personal. So what the cognitive principle matrix says is that you find the appropriate level and then move to the next level, just following one pathway. So if you're at level 3, which is where things are negative, let's say you make a mistake, then you feel guilty, and then you go up a level to self-control, and you fix the problem at level 4. So you start at level 3, where there's a negative situation happen. Guilt is the emotion of the mistake. Then you move to level 4, self-control, and fix the problem. If the negative and personal approach, the mistake is not seen as a mistake, it's seen as a failure, and guilt then becomes shame, and shame becomes blame, so you're down at level 1, and there's no fix. You move up a level to level 2 and cover it up with an addiction. That's simply how this model works. In order to recover from it, you have to have hope. You have to have unconditional acceptance to get you out of level 1. You have to have forgiveness at level 3, and you have to learn how to suffer at level 4. So in this module, we're talking about staying positive and personal, or negative and behaviour, and only moving between level 3 and 4 and not dropping down to level 1 or 2. We stay at level 3 by focusing on forgiveness. So we'll now look at how that works. In the previous slide, we were looking at the negative and behavioural related to making a mistake and feeling guilty. That's the third line from the bottom in this particular chart. So you could see how the guilt, we used self-control, had compassion for ourselves. We didn't take it personally, which is the first column, negative and personal, and get shame. So while we were speaking about making mistakes and feeling guilty, there's all these other emotions which occur negatively and should be treated behaviourally. Just running down from the top, there's the fear. We then move to the courage, build back our trust. We're angry, we become assertive and get our respect back. We're critical, we evaluate, and then we accept or reject. We're anxious, you become calm and commit again. We become guilt, self-control and compassion. Confusion, we have patience and have empathy with ourselves and others. Boredom, we take action because we care. We don't go to the negative and personal, where the fear becomes paranoid fear, the anger becomes rage, the criticalness becomes rejection, the anxious becomes panic, the guilt becomes shame, confusion becomes hopelessness, and the boredom becomes despair. When you're in that negative and personal space, we then to drop down to the false behaviour at the bottom, the fantasy, the conceit, the greed, the false self-confidence. So on this particular diagram, we're looking at using support. So while the challenge might be on the left-hand column rising, support across the bottom comes through drawing on principles. So as we select principles, we move from the left-hand side to the right-hand side because of the support of principles as the challenge, whatever the challenge is that rises. That's how we move through the matrix. So in this slide, we're looking at negative principles, and we're looking at how we use them, even though we're stuck on level 3, to work through a process of understanding of what the emotions mean. If we understand what negative emotions mean, we can follow the process even without moving to higher levels or drawing on spiritual principles. We first need to understand the process. So the process is that fear is not a physical threat, it's just awareness. And anger is the defense. Why was I attacked? The emotional attack. What caused the emotional attack? That causes the anger. The sadness is why was I attacked? That gives us an understanding of the fear. Why was I attacked? Criticalness is how do I fix the attack? So I need to evaluate it to see what's happened that caused the emotional attack in the fear. And then I've got to move to the fix. So until I've got a fix, I might be confused, but confusion is just something I have to sit with until I can resolve it. I might have anxiety, so I just have to have patience and sit with the anxiety. I might have guilt. I've just got to stick with self-control and fix the problem. You don't always flow around that in a nice circle. You might get stuck on anger. You might go to sadness and criticalness, and as you're critical, you feel angry, you're back to anger again. Or you might go to anxiety and shift back to sadness. But if you follow the process all the way around, even though you'll cycle through it, you'll eventually get through the process and you won't drop out of the process. Your fear won't be paranoid fear. Your anger won't be rage. Your sadness won't be complicated grief where you make it bigger than what it is. Your critical doesn't deteriorate into verbal abuse. Your confusion doesn't become hopelessness. Your anxiety doesn't become panic. And your guilt doesn't become shame because you stay focused on the process. That's how you deal with negative situations. We finally come to dealing with negative principles using forgiveness. So the way we do forgiveness is split the person from the behavior. We forgive the person because we don't want to hold resentment in our gut. If we hold resentment in our gut, it weakens our self-control, our patience, our persistence, our calmness, our courage. We don't want resentment. So the way to get past resentment is to forgive the person, but not their behavior. The way that we deal with behavior is with rules, boundaries, and consequences. The rules and boundaries are fair, they're consistent, they're age appropriate, and they escalate based on how the person's responding to the boundaries that are being set. So you don't go in too heavy, too hard. You start with lower level rules with consequences, and the consequences gradually get more if the person keeps breaking the rules and boundaries. And the final consequence might be that you have to cut off from them and can't deal with this person anymore. But that's just the outcome of this process. But the idea is to move up from level 3 to level 4 using the spiritual principle of forgiveness. We've got to the end of module 3 and we have to ask ourselves, can we do these 3 steps or have we done them to finish off module 3? First step 7, we ask the real self with humility to help us remove the shadow. The question is, have we used humility? Are we prepared to give up our self-interest, our greed, our self-centeredness? Step 8, have we made a list of all the persons we have harmed and became willing to forgive them by splitting the person from the behavior and forgiving the person, but not the behavior, unless the behavior was in the past and therefore it's of concern to us, so we just accept it happened. Step 9, we have now forgiven those who have harmed us and we have forgiven ourselves, once again by splitting the person from the behavior. If we have done steps 7, 8, and 9 successfully, We're now ready to move on to the fourth and final module. In Module 4, we continue to grow. We realise we're still subject to addictions and that we need to follow the general pathway, the one pathway towards the I am. The specific consciousness can lead us to a choice of comparative and predictive thinking based on habits that can lead to this or that, here or now, there or then. And we're likely to follow the that, there, then, rather than the this, here, now. And so we're going to stay on the one pathway, and this time we're going to grow using suffering. Once again, we're looking at the cognitive principle matrix, and we're operating at level 4. We're trying to grow out of level 3 to level 4. So we're moving up the matrix. And we're using the spiritual principle on level 7 of suffering. And suffering works because suffering involves growth out of a negative to a positive. You don't grow quickly if you're already in a positive. For instance, if you're already operating at level 5 and you have trust, it's hard to grow courage when you already trust somebody. It's hard to grow assertiveness when you already respect the person. And so, but you do grow when you're operating in level 3. When you have fear, you get the opportunity to grow courage. When you're angry, you get the opportunity to be assertive. When you're critical, you get the opportunity to evaluate, then accept or reject. So suffering is a way of growth, but we have to choose suffering, not to blame. A lot of people will suffer and blame or think suffering's bad, but suffering can be used for growth if it's used correctly. We'll now look more into suffering. When we were in Module 3, we were looking at negative principles and the concept of forgiveness. That is, splitting the person from the behaviour, forgiving the person but not the behaviour. In level 4, we're looking at suffering. You can't suffer and grow if you haven't previously learned to forgive the person and focus on the behaviour, because you'll tend to suffer and blame because you'll still take it personally. So when you're on level 3 and you're moving to level 4 and then moving up from level 4, you need to suffer and grow and not blame. Because if you blame, you'll drop down to shame at level 1, and then you'll activate the false negative, false positive addiction cycle again. So suffering is a good way to get out of addiction, but it requires the precursory step of forgiveness. In the one pathway, the purpose of the right brain at level 5 in relationships is to experience love through attachment. And we use trust, respect, acceptance, and commitment. Those green circles, trust, respect, acceptance, and commitment, to form relationships and build security through attachment. But when we're overcoming addictions, we need to build the same 4 principles in ourselves. We need trust and respect in ourselves, and we need to accept and commit to the job. In this module and this course, we're talking about addiction. So the goal is to overcome addiction. Now, we might be able to trust and respect ourselves because we've now acquired the knowledge, skill, and experience from this course. So we can trust it and respect ourselves that we know what we have to do, but we have to then accept and commit to the job of getting rid of addiction. So we have to follow the rules and the boundaries and the consequences, which are outlined in this course. That's the second step. Once we've followed the first step and have acquired the knowledge. Then we've got to change our core beliefs and focus on the one pathway, the I am. And then we've got to improve our impulse control. And that's what we're doing with suffering. Impulse control is our influencing principles at level 4. They involve the courage, the patience, the persistence. Because without the impulse control, you lose control and you don't achieve your goal of reducing your addiction. So in summary, you have to trust and respect yourself through knowledge, skill, and experience. You have to accept and commit to the job of stopping addiction by following the rules and the boundaries and understanding the consequences. You have to follow the one pathway, not forever, but just for the purpose of getting through the addiction. And you have to control your impulses through suffering. So you suffer and grow the courage, the patience, the self-control that ensures that you get to the goal. And if you repeat these processes enough, it becomes a habit, an automatic thought, an automatic reaction. And the goal of reducing addictions becomes a real possibility. We discussed the mantra earlier in this course. We're once again using it. The way we use it now relates to Module 3 and 4. In Module 3, we were dealing with forgiveness, splitting the person from the behaviour, forgiving the person. In Module 4, we're looking at suffering and grow, not blame. So how we use the mantra to cover these two modules, Module 3 and Module 4, is to say the word forgiveness and then suffering and then stop thinking and then just say the mantra, I am hope, love, peace and joy. Because that words hope, love, peace and joy, I am, aligns the thinking to the right brain, to the one pathway towards the I am. So we're connecting the suffering, which is the growth part, and the forgiveness, which is forgiving the person part, to the right brain. So that's the mantra to continue saying as we grow our suffering and grow our forgiveness. Up until this point, we've looked at the cognitive principle matrix as a 7-level matrix. At level 1 and 2 is where we've lost control and experienced the false negative and then covered it up with the addiction at level 2, the false positive. We then moved to overcoming fear at level 3, building courage at level 4, building trust at level 5, and then mastering specific consciousness through level 6 under the guidance of the spiritual principles at level 7. In the next slide, we'll look at the model as a 9-level model, assuming we've dropped off levels 1 and 2 at the bottom and we've moved on past our addiction. We're now going to look at level 8 and level 9. And level 8 is the transition from specific consciousness to general consciousness. And level 9 is rising to the I am, and it just is in general consciousness. We'll now have a look at the new cognitive principle matrix at the 9 levels. This is the last slide in the series before we enter to the final 3 steps in the 12-step program, steps 10, 11 and 12. And it's the revised cognitive principle matrix, and it's dropped off the bottom 2 levels but added 2 new levels at the top. So the way we now move through the matrix once our addiction is overcome is to start with negative principles, which are normal negative feelings we have every day, or certainly most days. And we use our spiritual principles at level 7 that are marked in red. So we have hope. We know we can move out of our fear. We know we can move to the next level of courage through hope. We unconditionally accept that negative events happen in our lives that result in negative emotions. And we've learnt to forgive the person from the behaviour so that we're only dealing with the behaviour. Therefore, we can move to level 4 and suffer and grow level 4 out of level 3. And then we're at level 5. We can go to spiritual principles of unconditional giving and giving trust, respect, acceptance and commitment, but with rules and boundaries and consequences, so that if it doesn't come back, we can take consequences to keep ourselves safe. But we unconditionally give trust, respect, acceptance and commitment. And we can operate in our experiencing self in our head at level 6 with wisdom, but always under the guidance of level 7 of gratitude and humility, so that the ego doesn't grow. And that way we'll seek the truth with integrity and justice and assurance and clarity and honesty and curiosity. And we'll be operating correctly using the 7 levels. And now we're ready to move to the higher levels, because we're moving out of specific consciousness into general consciousness, where it's just the I am and it is. So in order to move there, we have to be in awe, in adoration, we have to surrender, we have to have devotion, we have to have oneness, we have to have love, we have to wonder about our consciousness, our conscience, which is the I am, and things just are, it just is. So in the I am and is, we're above our experiencing self in specific consciousness. And in that place, we'll find peace and there'll be no addiction. That's the goal of this course, is to get the I am, I am, and it just is. We've now reached the final 3 steps in the 12-step program. Step 10, we continue to review our negative principles and suffer and grow out of them. Step 11, we've sought through reflection and acceptance to follow our real self and unconditionally give relationship principles to others and ourselves. Step 12, having had a spiritual awakening, our experienced self now has gratitude and seeks wisdom in the I am. So we continue to use it, I am, whenever we have that feeling of addiction coming back into our life. But once it's gone, we don't need to follow the I am. The I am is just a single pathway out of addiction. It's not reality. We can't live in the I am all the time. It's just a way of getting through addiction. We have to live in the real world of the experiencing self. But what we now have is a program where we feel addiction may take over our lives. We can go back to the one pathway, to the I am. Once again, we're looking at the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. We could just read through these if you needed to, just to remind yourself that the 12 steps for 2025 are far more structured. There's far more linkages between the power of God in our lives and our behaviour. We've changed that to the I am, the God to the I am. The behaviour is still the same, but the processes are a lot different. Once you've read through these, this is the end of this course on addictions.